I think we'll start the same way that we have the last few evenings, with a bit of a discussion on some things dealing with missions, and then at some point we'll look at the Scripture and look at the idea that God remains. Maybe just a little teaser here. I've got a plaque, and to anybody who's under 15 years old who can tell me the theme of our time together during this missions conference, I'll give you this plaque. What's the theme of the missions? 2 words, a little hint. What's the theme? That'd be under 15, so those of you who are like old. What was that again? Close, but as they say in Russia, wrong. Anybody else want to add something? They really do say that. Under 15?
I just wanted to know, did you get that at the rummage sale?
Faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Yes, I got it at the garage sale, free. Relate, reveal, remains, close. But as they say in Russia, close. Or as they say in the United States, that's good. Does anybody have another idea? Yes? There you go. You were just read the top line, didn't you? Thank you. There's also DVDs back there from the garage sale that are $5 a piece. If you want to take any of those, feel free to do those. Just leave the donation in the box there. Okay. Since I know you can do more than one thing at a time, you can listen and you can also do some other things. So be thinking, because just a little bit we want to have just some discussion, because I know those of you do some things perhaps in your home to deal with missions, whether it's reading a book or having some prayer time or whatever it is. And if we can just brainstorm together some of those things that are possible to do to keep missions like forefront, or at least close to the front of thinking, because I'm sure you do more things than just have a mission conference every 2 years. So just be brainstorming some things that either you do or that you think would be helpful to do to get started. So be thinking of that as we talk about some things. Last night we talked about the fact that God reveals. The night before it was God relates. He's a relational being because he's triune. He reveals because he's triune. Tonight we're going to talk about that fact that he remains. He remains faithful to the covenant that he has within the three of the Trinity, and that means he created then a universe of which he is also faithful to his children and to his creation. That's the main point. You can come back in another 45 minutes, and we'll be talking about the same thing if you want to do that. But I was just thinking as I went out to your farm this morning. I want to thank you for the biggest breakfast I've had in a long, long time. Where I can't believe you have both sausage and bacon with the eggs. But I was thinking as I was going out in terms of God revealing that if you had eyes to see today, then God revealed himself to you, didn't he? Whether it's in a cloud or a bird or seeing another person. If you had ears to hear, if you heard a mourning dove, if you heard the wind blowing, then God revealed himself to you. If you talked to another person, then God revealed himself to you in the very fact that you can even have a relationship with another person, that you can even talk to another person, that we can understand each other. The very fact that when you got in your automobile and it started is a revelation that there is a God, because believe it or not, that's not just scientifically, that doesn't happen just scientifically, because it says in Hebrews that the Lord Jesus Christ holds everything together. The reason your motor stayed together while you came over here is because Jesus Christ is holding that stuff together. God reveals himself to us all of the time. I think we probably have also seen that in all of this that our God is a missional God. That is, He's a God who has a purpose. He's on a mission. He's doing something. And maybe here's a kicker, and He was doing that, and He was a missional God before He ever created creation. He didn't need creation in order to be a missional God. Wrap that around your head. He was a missional God when He was 3 and 1 in eternity past. He was on a mission. You know what that mission was? And if you do, this would be the time that you would say. He chose us before the foundations of the world. He was on a mission. And that was a long time ago. And in that choosing, He was on a mission, even within the Trinity, of glorifying Himself. Now that might sound that sounds strange. It might sound strange because if we're not really fond of people who do that. That is, glorify themselves. Say, Johnny, could you stand up and just glorify yourself a little bit for us?
Not a chance.
No, we don't. As human beings, we don't, and we shouldn't be doing that. God, as the Trinity, is perfectly righteous in glorifying Himself, and He's on a mission to do that. Before creation. We have a missional God. We have a missional book. From Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22, verse 20-ish. It's a... Better check. You know, one of the things that the Russian authorities did back in just after World War II, when there were some Russian Christians who were being persecuted, if they wanted to get out of the country, they had to go before authorities, if they could get a hearing before the authorities, to be excused and leave the country. They had to pass a test to prove that they were genuine believers. And some of the questions on that test, we were told by believers in Siberia, were things like this: how many chapters are there in Malachi? How many verses in the last chapter of Revelation? Come on. 21. Yeah. You get to go. Yeah. 21. You're right. Those kinds of questions they had. It's a missional book. And then He has a church, His people, and we're to be a missional people. That is, we have a purpose for being here. We have a purpose for being a body. It's to worship Him, to grow in Him, and then to shine, to let others know about the Lord Jesus Christ. A missional body. We are to be missional individuals as well, to have a purpose in life. God has given each of us a reason and a purpose to exist. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. We have a reason to exist. God has you on planet Earth for a purpose, for a mission, whatever that might be. Otherwise, you wouldn't be. As a missional God. Before we get to some ideas about just keeping missions and this whole idea of being missional in the local church as individuals, I want to talk a little bit about these two words, globalism and pluralism, in terms of missions as well. Two things that are going on in the world, of which you probably hear these words, at least the top one probably, globalism. How would you define globalism if someone were to ask you, which I am? Globalism. Pardon? Around the world. And it's the interest of the entire world over any individual country. That idea is, you've heard the term, it's on the news, the interest of the entire world over any individual country. I think as we hear that word more and more, we might, sort of a narrative that goes along with that is that we're becoming a global village. We're coming closer to one another with all of the technology and the internet and Facebook and cell phones, that we're starting to talk more the same language, and it's drawing us all closer together. And to that last statement, I say baloney, because of what's happening. Another thing that's happening is this whole idea of pluralism. And if you were to define pluralism and you had some time to think about it, time's up. Well, how would you define pluralism? More than one idea. And flesh that out a little bit more, add a little bit more to that. More than one idea, plural idea. More than one way to get to heaven. All kinds of ways to get to heaven. It's the idea that there's more than one absolute or authority, and they coexist. Sort of like that sign that says coexist, and it has all those different, it has the cross, and it has the sign of the Jewish sign, and all of those. That's a good picture of the idea of pluralism. All these exist, they coexist, and they're all equal. That idea. That idea has gained a lot of traction since about 1940 and 50 when a fella in Quebec came up with two ideas, postmodernism and what he called meta-narrative. And he said in postmodernism there's no such thing, that meta-narratives aren't credible. By meta-narrative he means a grand story. What he was trying to say is there's no universal story that has authority over the whole globe. That's what he was saying. And he's saying postmodernism throws that idea out. There's no universal grand story. So what he was saying is that this is what we're going to resort to. There's lots of grand stories. Every culture can have their grand story, and they're all equal. Particularly in the last, I'd say, 30, 40 years, that has gained traction even in the mission arena, and in some cases, I think maybe has taken the idea too far, where this whole idea of indigeneity and indigenous churches, where the Chinese need to have their church in Winnipeg, and the white people need to have their church in Winnipeg, and the native people need to have their church in Winnipeg, and the Sikhs need to have their church in Winnipeg, because they all have their stories, they need to keep separate, as if the gospel wasn't about all of us getting together, which was the whole point of Galatians and of bringing us together rather than keeping us separate. Now, there may be times when it's good and proper to do that kind of thing, but not as a whole, because I think we're following in the trail of every group has their separate story, so we need to keep everybody separate, and we need to respect everybody's story as if it's equal. You can see that what's happening even in First Nations or Native work, where there's the emphasis of a story of a minority group that we all need to focus on and consider as equal as our biblical story. That kind of thing. So we just want to note that, and we'll be probably talking about it towards the end of our time together if we have time to get back to that. Now, before we open God's Word and look at the book of Hebrews for a second, some ideas you have about missions and keeping missions front and center. What might that be? While you're thinking, I grabbed a couple of these off your mission board, and I know we have a mission board at our church in Bonners Ferry as well. It's not quite as obvious as you folks, but very few people go look at it because it's always there, and it's just always there, and that'd be a lot of reading. But obviously these are sent for some reason, and man, there's some stuff here that even if you copy these off and took it home, like this one from is it Scoville? Is that their name? Yep. Dave and Esther Scoville. Okay. Having arrived at Sentani early Wednesday morning, I flew interior with Wupu to the Dane Church in Ilu on Friday. Since I'm nursing a skipping heart and trying to save myself from being brought home in a jar, Whoopi and I began our 3 days of teaching early Tuesday morning with some 400 to 500 excited pastors and elders with their wives gathered.
He's in his 80s.
Pardon?
He's in his 80s.
He's in his 80s.
That's why.
Ooh, most of us are in a jar by that time. This one from Ed and Glenna Houston. This is the magazine that comes from their mission organization, where it talks about the villages around the Lake Lake Baikal. The Burdiat people live around that Lake Baikal, and it says, besides a few resort towns on the lake, the surrounding area seems empty, and it is this perception has led many communities being forgotten. But the closer look reveals there are 500 communities in Buryatia, which is that republic around the Lake Baikal. Of these, the vast majority are populated by Buryat people who practice the tenets of shamanism and Buddhism. Really, they have Buddhism on the exterior and shamanism in the interior. Shamanism sort of like animism, worship of spirits and that sort of thing.
Northern Russia.
Close. It's actually southern Russia.
Is it?
Yeah, but it's in the Far East or Siberia. It's right down near the border of Mongolia and China. But it's a cold part of the former Soviet Union. Those kinds of things, and you can read on and on and on. So I'm just stating the obvious now, but that sometimes, because I think something about human nature, sometimes it's easy just to bypass all that stuff back there because it's just always there. It comes every so often and it changes. But obviously it's not there to be bypassed. Those are things that you can pray for and pray between the lines because there's only so much paper. They only say so many things. Use your imagination. What does that mean? You go on the internet and look at Buryatia. How many mission groups are working with the Buryats? There are a lot. But what are they doing? How many people are actually living there, or are most of the missions, doing, drive-by shootings, as it were, drive-by evangelism, fly in, fly out. Drive-by shooting probably isn't the best. Pardon?
A little bit poor analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. But it made the point. And sometimes the result is about the same, which is part of the point. That kind of thing. Other things that you can think of. That you either are doing, think you should be, or should be doing, if I might be so bold, since I'm from here. While you're thinking, here's another one. I went into your library. And I found these books on missions. And I don't know how often you go back there and get a book on missions and read it, but man, there's a lot of good stuff. Now, as Susno stood by his bed, his eyes turned towards a lovely picture that was nailed to his wall. A friend had given it to him before he had come out to this secluded spot. The picture was of a steep mountain with a narrow, straight path leading up to it. It had a great meaning for Sunatu, for below it were the words, I am the way, the truth, and the life, John 14:6. While he was looking at this picture and thinking about it, he failed to hear the shuffling in the grass beside the long, narrow window of his bedroom. Earlier, when he had gotten to the front door, he was certain no one was about. There was not a sound, nothing to suggest that any other person was around that night. He knew there were men who were after him ever since he had turned from his old religion. There had been men who wanted to kill him. It had cost him something to become a Christian. His family had turned against him and put him out of his home. Why do you want to be a follower of that Jesus, they said, hating him? even spitting in his face. And we'll read some more when you come back tomorrow night. That's what they always do at camp, right? That kind. Peace Child. Have you read Peace Child? In the Presence of Mine Enemies, a fairly recent one where the couple was abducted by some followers of Osama bin Laden in the Philippines and kept for a year over there before they finally got away. Tortured for Christ, kind of a classic. George Mueller, just go down the... And if you have the stomach, this one isn't necessarily on missions, but if you have the stomach for it, the classic Fox's Book of Martyrs. I don't know how many of you have read this book, but I wouldn't advise reading it over Christmas. Because literally it will turn your stomach. If you can get through this one without shedding a tear or throwing up, then you can take 10 DVDs home with you. Well, we probably don't have to belabor this, but just the idea that you can't survive focusing on missions by having a missions conference every 2 years. Obviously, there has to be other things that you go on, whether that's a missions prayer meeting once a month where you just zero in on that, or whatever it is that you do, either as a local body or as families, something to keep yourself and your family members aware of the fact that we are a missional. We are on a mission. We belong to a missional family. We have a missional God. We have a missional book. With that, anybody have something to add to that, or before we move on? Okay. And I forgot all about the dog story, the dog nose story. Before I completely forgot that. So if there's time, I'll throw it in at the end. If you boys, where's the gal?
She's in the nursery with the little guy.
Okay. If you promise to remember the point of the story, not just the story. Okay. I think most other people have heard the story, but we'll give you the Reader's Digest version later on. Just to get started here before we look at Hebrews, I think we may be all aware that they're saying that there's more persecution, more people being tortured for their faith, more people that die for their faith each day now than at any other time in the history of the world. I'm sure you've probably heard that. I've heard reports of anywhere from 15 to 30 people a day, Christians, who die because of being tortured for their faith. That means in the hour that we're going to be together, at least one, probably, a person who knows Christ has been killed, tortured because of their faith in Christ. As we sit here together this evening, in the former Soviet Union, when we were there in the 90s, there wasn't that kind of persecution so much, but we did see some. Here's an example. This person was persecuted because he moved from his traditional religion over into Christianity, much as the story that we read in that children's missionary book, and because his own people and his family tried to do him under. His name was Alexei. He was a Yakutian person, became a believer, was coming to the one evangelical church in the capital city of Yakut. And I think he'd only been coming a month or so when one Sunday we heard that he was in the hospital because that week, and this was in the wintertime, so every day it's 50 below Celsius, so what is that, 65 or so below Fahrenheit. He was on his way home, and some of his friends accosted him, beat him up, stripped him of his clothes, and threw his body under. He was just a little guy. One of the things about working in some of the other countries of the world, particularly, and Yakutia is one of them, is that I'm tall, which isn't the only reason I went there. But Alexei about that high. They stripped him of his clothes, all of them, and threw him under a building. So all of the buildings are about that far off of the ground with pillars underneath, so that the heat of the building doesn't melt the permafrost. Threw him underneath there to die, and obviously it wouldn't take long for him to die. But then they left. Somebody came along and had seen what was going on and rescued him, took him to the hospital, and he survived. Alexei survived. So that kind of thing was, it didn't happen every day, but it wasn't front page news either, like really strange. Those kinds of things happen. I remember when we first got to Yakutia, first night there, after we went to bed, it was the next morning, I woke up fairly early because the air mattress that Kathleen and I were on had lost its air during the night, and so the only thing that was separating us and cold cement was about 2 layers of plastic. So I was laying there thinking, and we just got there. Our 2 boys were teenagers. Kathleen was there, and I was laying there. Everybody else was asleep, and I thought to myself, what in the world have I done? In very unlike Hudson Taylor fashion, I was scared. I was thinking that, have I made a mistake? Is this the dumbest thing I've ever did? Or can you think of a couple that were dumber? Those kinds of things that, why am I here? I felt alone. I'd like to report that I was thinking, man, what a glorious opportunity here to tell people about Jesus. But I was thinking, oh man, like heavy aloneness. The Trinity remains in the sense that they, as 3 in 1, they always remain faithful to each other. It's a covenant that they have between them. They never separate from each other. They're loyal. None of the Trinity are ever lonely. None of the Trinity ever say to the other one, the Father never says to the Holy Spirit, say, have you seen the Son around? He was here earlier. None of that. They always remain connected at the hip, as it were. Faithful. No divorce, no separation, except for when Christ was on the cross. Eh? And that must have been horrendous. Particularly, and I have no way of getting my head around this. I don't know how this works. But for a God who is timeless and is not trapped in time, nor does he think in time, what is that like for that one instance? For us, it's one instance in time. What is it for God who is not in time? I have no idea. All I know is that from our perspective, for that 3 hours plus, that there was separation at the hip between the Trinity. There was divorce. As God poured out his wrath on his Son. Can't imagine. For any of you who have been a dad, can you imagine? No, you can't imagine. And don't bother imagining pouring wrath out on your son for yahoos. That's about the most pleasant word I can think for you guys. Us guys. But within the Trinity, they remain completely faithful to each other. Then they created a universe in which they are faithful in their covenant relationship with their people and with creation. And the reason that remain faithful like that is because within the Trinity, that's within their nature. You can see the pattern. We're just hammering this thing to death in terms of the Trinity and what it means to be 3 in 1, and what that means in terms of how they created the universe and how the universe works and their relationship with the universe. They are faithful to us. The book of Hebrews, even the title of the book of Hebrews, if you have it open there, we'll look at a few passages there, but we'll start with the title. We know that these people that God had called him to himself in the Old Testament, they were called Jews, they were called Israelites, they were called Hebrews. Why is this book not entitled Israelites or Jews? Why is it entitled Hebrews? Believe it or not, we could camp on this for a long time. But why is it called Hebrews rather than Jews or Israelites? I believe there's a reason. And so this would be the time I would tell you what it is. That the word Hebrew, it's used two ways in the Old Testament. One, it's used by foreigners in reference to the Israelites. Like when Pharaoh's daughter found Moses in the basket, she said, one of the children of the Hebrews. So it's one of the ways foreigners spoke about Israelites. It's also the way the Israelites spoke of themselves. The word, I think the first time we find it, it's in Genesis 14, where it talks of Abraham, where he's going. A soldier comes and tells them about Lot being captured, and so Abraham's going to go and rescue him. It says that there came one that had escaped and told Abraham the Hebrew. That word that was attached to the Israelites and the Jews had the connotation and the meaning in that language of being a wanderer, a sojourner, somebody who was wandering throughout the land, and they didn't have a land of their own. We have a word that we use for that as well, and I learned it, at least one connotation of it, when we went to Canada the first time to work with Native people. We went through the border at Victoria. So we were over on, is that an island in Washington? Took the ferry over to Victoria. Maybe it's a peninsula, isn't it? It's a peninsula because we could. And there we were entering into Canada to go to a camp for 3 months to learn how to do cross-cultural work. But our home was in Tanacross, Alaska. That's where my driver's license was from. But I spent the last year in Bible school, so I think the insurance that we had was from Alberta for our vehicles. But I had picked up a trailer here in Montana for my folks, and it had a Montana license plate on it. We had then spent 6 months in Oregon, so I had some other papers from Oregon, and we came to the border and had these papers, and we were dressed like we came from Oklahoma. No offense for anybody who happens to be from Oklahoma. They were there, and it was nighttime. It was a beautiful summer evening, and the guy came out and looked at the vehicle, and being fairly intelligent, he said, "Why don't you get your papers and come on in here?" Our boys were about this high. We went in. I showed him the papers, and he looked at this. One from Montana, driver's license from here, the insurance from there, whatever we had from Oregon. He said, and this was obviously before 9/11. He put it all back and said, "Let's just go look at your vehicle." We started out there. Our boys were walking alongside him. They had never seen a man wearing pants with a stripe down the side. So I looked over, and here's Trevor pulling at the guy's pants. I said, "Don't." The guy stopped about from here to that door, looked at our vehicle, looked at the papers again, handed me the papers, and said, "Gypsies." And then he said, That's the precise connotation of the word Hebrews. Gypsies, wandering people, don't have a home of their own, just wandering around. And I believe that has some kind of a clue as to the whole book of Hebrews, the very title, because doesn't it say then, let's see, I'm going to skip some here because we're moving. In fact, I'm going to skip a lot. It says in chapter 11, verses 12 to 16, the author, whoever the author of the book of Hebrews is, he's speaking to these descendants of Abraham, and it says that they acknowledged they were strangers and foreigners on earth. For those who speak in such a way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. In fact, if they had been thinking of the land that they had left, they would have opportunity to return, but as it is, they aspire to a better land that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. one of the whole central motifs, the central idea of the book of Hebrews. Yes, it is the fact that Jesus is better. He's better than the prophets. He's better than the angels. He's better than Moses. He's better than the priest. He has a better covenant, has a better worship place. He has a better sin sacrifice. That's the flow of the book of Hebrews, isn't it? But in all of that, he's also, as he works up to chapter 11 and chapter 12, which is kind of the crescendo where the preacher, I don't know if your preacher does this or not, but when he gets to the main point, he might be jumping down, pounding on the pulpit and saying, "All right!" I know he doesn't do that. But I think the fellow who wrote the book of Hebrews, at about chapter 12, he's about at that emotional point, and letting them know that because it's a time of persecution, isn't it? This is shortly after Nero had, remember the Nero who was a few bales shy of a full stack when it was crazy, and he set fire to, he had some of his people set fire to part of Rome at that point, because he wanted to rebuild that and then get some fame for himself. So instead of getting fame for himself, he got flame for himself, because I think about all but 4 of the districts of the city were burned up. So they blamed that. They had to blame it on somebody, so they blamed it on some Christian folks, and that started persecution in about 64 A.D. And so that was going on, persecution against Christian people. At the same time, if you were a Jewish Christian, you were getting persecution from that because you were a Christian. You were also getting persecution from your Jewish side, because then you had stepped away from the story that had been given by God in the Old Testament, but you had stepped out and embraced a different story that included Jesus Christ and his perspective of that Old Testament story. So your own people were also persecuting you. So some of the believers during that time when the book of Hebrews was written were thinking about going back to the old way, to the Jewish system, and the writer writes to them and saying, no. Because up until that time, in this story, a big part of that story was the fact of the land that they had. They were to own the land. They were to control the land. They were to live off the land, to experience the fruits of the land. And now that's being taken from them. So it looks to them like God has left them. It looks to them because of persecution, and believe me, if persecution comes to North America and that happens, there's going to be some of us who think, "Where are you, God?" You better believe it. And there was a lot of people during that day who were thinking, "God, where are you?" That's why they were thinking, is there some way we can get out from underneath this, which is the normal human experience when it comes to persecution and suffering. And so in chapter 11 there, he says, this home is not our land. We're just a passing through. There's a heavenly place for us. An incredible lesson for not only those people, for all of God's people, as we live upon this earth and we live in our pretty nice homes here in North America, in a pretty nice life. One of the reasons I think sometimes we don't think as much about heaven is because why would we want to go there? Why would we even want to go there? Well, once we get there, we'll find out the answer to that pretty fast. But during that day, the author reminds them that, no, it's not the land, not this land. No, it's not Jerusalem, it's not that city. There's a better land and there's a better city. And that's what our eyes need to be focused on. He zeroes in on that. And then in chapter 12, which is where I think the preacher might be pounding the pulpit, because many see this as a sermon as opposed to just a letter that needs to be circulated, where he says, surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, let's run the race, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Interesting. He starts out chapter 11, and he says that faith is something we can't see. Then in chapter 12, he says, keep your eyes on Jesus. So keep your eyes on somebody that you can't see. At that point is what he's saying. You can't see him, but he's not virtual. He's real. Something like when we lived in Okotoks, Alberta, worked downtown Calgary, to Office of Interact Ministries, and across it was an office building that had a number of Christian organizations in it. And after I'd been there a couple of years, across the hall, down the way, a Christian counselor rented that room. His name was Fred. I can't remember his last name, but he was a recent graduate of Moody Bible Institute, had his degree in counseling, and he's put his shingle up as a Christian counselor. So I would go over and visit Fred because he was a unique individual because he was blind from birth. He would walk to work with his cane, listening to those sounds at the crosswalk. Fascinating guy. One day I was over talking to him at the office. It was after work. It was 5 o'clock, and we got to talking a little bit more. And then he mentioned that he was a marathon runner. Now, as soon as he said that, I thought, I can't walk a straight line with my eyes shut. And he's running a marathon. So after he explained a little bit about running a couple of marathons, I said, Fred, hold it a second. Just time out. How? What are you talking about? That isn't a marathon 26 miles? Yeah. So how do you do that, Fred? He said, my wife is also a marathon runner. And my wife has eyes and she can see. My wife runs just ahead of me to the right, and I follow her, and I know her footsteps. I know the sound of her footsteps. And it doesn't matter how many other people are running. It doesn't matter what the crowd is saying. It doesn't matter whether we're at the end or the beginning. It doesn't matter whether it's hot or cold. I know those footsteps. I can't see her, but I'm following those footsteps. Man, I thought, I'm going to go home and write that down, because I've never forgotten the impact of that, the lesson of that in terms of Hebrews chapter 12, of keeping our eyes on Christ, whom we can't see. I've never seen him. I've never heard him. He's never spoken to me. And the author wants these people to know that he is with them. Doesn't he tell them in chapter 13, sort of ending it off, he says, although the context there is finances, which seems a little bit odd, but I think he's writing to them in terms of that even in your financial situation, in your whole situation, in this whole thing of persecution, I am, in chapter 13, verse 5, I am with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. In the midst of that particular time in history, when the Church of Jesus Christ in that particular area of the Jewish people was undergoing significant persecution, but they had no idea that it was going to get worse. It was going to get much worse. Read about the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. in your spare time. I will never leave you or forsake you. I will remain with you. Why? Because I remain with myself in terms of a faithful covenant, and I remain with my people in a faithful covenant that's just as secure, just as true, just as strong as the covenant that we have between the three of us in the Trinity. I will never leave you or forsake you. We'll close with a dog story. And remember the point. The year is 1997, and we bought a log cabin on the edge of town in Yakutsk because we wanted our boys to have more room to run and play, and we have a garden, and our boys were boys, and they like to throw rocks and stuff like that there. So we bought this old cabin, and with this cabin, no running water or anything like that, with this cabin it was $16,000 US. So you got the cabin, a stockade around it that's about 9 feet high. That's to keep bad people out. And just in case bad people get in, a dog came with the place, a guard dog. His name was Bouillon, and he's on a chain. The chain goes as far as the one gate that comes into the stockade. And if anybody doesn't have the permission to come in, or we don't go out and calm down Bouillon, then he eats them. Literally, that's the security system, and it works really, really well. And really, he's trained to literally tear people to pieces, which is why he's on the chain. Trevor, our youngest son, was given the job of taking care of Bouillon, feeding him, that sort of thing. So we were 3 days into this cabin. Trevor's got the dog sort of under control. He feeds him. He came running in to the cabin and said, Dad, Bouillon got loose. Got off his chain. Trevor never did tell me how he got off his chain, but I think I know. And somebody had come into the gate at that time, and Bouillon, instead of attacking him, saw that he's off the chain, and he hightailed it out onto the street. So I went out there because across the street from us is a Ostanovka, is a bus stop where old ladies stand and little children, and I didn't want Bouillon to eat one of them. So everything was okay. I went around the corner of our house, and there's a kind of an alleyway with a telephone pole. By the way, it's just a telephone pole. There's no wire on the telephone pole. Never has been. The pole's been there for about 20 years, but it's a telephone pole. Tells you something about the whole scenario. There at the base of that pole was Bouillon sniffing at something. So I went over very, very carefully and got a hold of Bouillon. He doesn't have his collar on, and I just kind of got a hold of his skin and started leading him back to the house. We got about halfway there, and all of a sudden, which was pretty sudden, he just went berserk and started chomping and biting and attacking me. And about the second chomp, he got my nose, and he bit it off, and the nose fell. Well, I won't say what happened to the nose yet. But it was gone. I knew that much. It was October and cold, and it feels strange to breathe cold air with no nose. Blood's all over the place, and so I go into the house. I have my nose, I have my face covered, and Kathleen opens the door, and I said, Kathleen, I think we have a problem. And I went like this, and probably not the best way to introduce the whole thing, but that's what I did anyway. After she picked herself up off the floor, she sent one of the boys down to a Russian friend that we had down the street to get some help, and he came up and he called the equivalent of 911. Which eventually came. Meanwhile, this guy's name was Timothy, we would call him, and he had the good sense to say, Mike, where did this happen? I said, out there by that telephone pole, the one that doesn't have any telephone lines. He said, okay, I know where. He went out, and he found the nose, butter side up, out there on the street, and brought it in, and Kathleen put it in a little medicine jar with some water. The nurses or medics came, and the first thing they asked Kathleen, do you have some soap and a toothbrush? And Kathleen, she said no. We had lots of soap and we had plenty of toothbrushes, but she figured out what they were going to do and said, no, we don't have that. So they said, okay, well, we're going to make it right. So anyway, fast forward the story. Kathleen and I had agreement that we would not go to a Russian hospital unless we were dead. So we got to the hospital, and we got this little jar with a nose in it, and we go in, and there's two Yakutian doctors there. And we have a little consultation. They say, we have to sew that on now, or you're not going to have a nose for the rest of your life. Okay, yeah, good to go. Got into this little room. It was just a little room about half the size of your office. And in that office, there's a light bulb that comes down the middle. Wire come down, just a lone light bulb, nothing over the light bulb, and then a metal table right there. It looks like where they do operations during the day and interrogations at night to me. But take off your shoes, get on the table. So I took off my shoes, got on the table, put a cloth over me, and they say, this is going to hurt. Because they didn't have any anesthetic or anesthesia or anything like that. It was just, so they got a needle and thread, and they put the nose on, and they started sewing. At about 20-minute period, and the youngest doctor, Yakutian guy, he had kind of a sense of humor. About every 3 minutes, he'd say, "Borlinda," which means hurt, doesn't it? What in the world? Why don't you just, pardon my language, but why don't you just shut up? About 20 minutes in, I said, I can't take this anymore, because it hurt a fair bit. And then I had this thought. I said, if Kathleen could just come in here, if I could just hold somebody's hand. If somebody could just come in and have the warmth of a human being, that's all I ask. Well, if it's not Kathleen, I don't care who it is, as long as it isn't this funny doctor. I don't care who it is, male, female, as long as there's nothing in between. I don't care. And And I've said that Jesus had never spoken to me, and he hasn't. I've never heard God speak. But this is one of those times that there was an impression, as it were. It's about the best way I can think it, where I heard this verse from Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. I will never leave you or forsake you. Came with a kind of commentary that's running in my head. Mike, you have said that you believe in me. You have come out here. You have told people that God is everywhere. You have said that God is going to be with you. You have said that this is God's business. How about if I hold your hand? So I literally went like this under the table. And in fact, if you watch me before I speak, every time I go like this. Every time. And what I'm doing is I'm reminding myself that you are with me. You are holding my hand. The pain wasn't any less, not by any means. But there was a sense of, and I'm not, this isn't like tremendous, this isn't persecution, or it isn't even pain over the top, I don't think. But I think I think this must be what God does. In the midst of that, I knew that God was with me, and there was a sense of His presence that I have not ever felt before then or since. He will never leave us or forsake us in the mission that He has called you to. Why? Because He is a missional God, and He has a purpose, and He has a purpose for us. And He is with us, regardless of what the circumstances is, regardless of what the illness is, regardless of the relational trauma that we're going through. He will never leave us or forsake us. He remains. Why? Because He's 3 in 1.